A few years ago, my dad and I were out on a hunting trip together in Minnesota where we experienced something I'll never forget. Hudson was sleeping in the living room and all of a sudden he started barking. I mean barking like he was about to smash through the door and attack whatever was out there. My dad and I went out into the living room to calm him down, but he was standing at the door, hair standing up and barking like mad. My dad repeatedly tried to calm him down, but to no avail. Hudson started pawing at the door, all the while continuing his bark. I looked out the window expecting to see a wolf or bear wandering around, but I couldn't see anything at all. There's a motion sensor on the front of the cabin to deter the raccoons in the middle of the night, and that wasn't even tripped. Eventually Hudson calmed down, but he was still restless the rest of the night. I could hear Hudson walking around the cabin. It was almost as if he were standing guard over the whole place. We went out for our first day of hunting, but there wasn't anything worth firing a shot at. We went out on the porch for another cigarette. My dad pointed out that the night was unusually quiet, and I pointed out that the day was too. Something off was going on around these woods. Hudson started barking again, even more ferocious than the last night. We went back into the cabin and tried to hush him again, but he still wouldn't listen. Again I peered out of the window. Again I found nothing, except for this time the motion sensor was on. It wasn't on 2 minutes before that when we were out there. I began to make out movement just outside the light and strained my eyes to see past the light. I finally got my dad to look outside and his entire demeanor changed. He wasn't so laid back anymore. He was stiffened and agitated.
"That's not a bear, son,"
he said to me. "Then what the hell is it?" I asked. I went over to the gun rack and grabbed my Weatherby Vanguard rifle. My dad was instantly in front of me.
"You shoot at that thing and we're gonna have one hell of a problem. Just let it do its thing and wander off like it did last night."
I went to the window again and looked outside. The motion sensors were off, but I could just make out movement. It was still there. Hudson quieted down and started pacing around again. I told my dad I think it left, and he looked like he was relieved. He went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 glasses, and poured us both a serving of Jack Daniels, his favorite whiskey. He said he caught a glimpse of it and it looked like a wolf, but it was too big and bulky. I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I woke up to another round of Hudson's incessant barking. He was pawing at my door and barking like mad. I glanced at the window to the right of the bed and damn near fell out of the bed. Whatever Hudson was barking at was peering into the window. It was no wolf. This thing was gigantic. It stared right back at me. It was furry and black, had yellow eyes that looked like they were glowing, ears that were triangular, and sitting on top of its head, long canine teeth, and a long, wolf-like muzzle. It looked to me like it was hunched over or crouching down so it could look in the window. Then it licked the screen on the window. I leapt out of bed and bolted out of the room. My dad was already awake, and I started yelling at him that the thing was back outside. I grabbed my rifle again, not caring about my dad's warning. But it was gone. My dad was right behind me and told me not to shoot, that it would just piss it off. He told me he thought it was a werewolf. I saw it with my own eyes. It really did look like a werewolf, like from the underground movies. He told me that when he saw it, it was standing on 2 legs and it must have been at least 8 feet tall. I moved out of the bedroom into the living room and looked out of the window. The sensor was tripped again, but I couldn't see the thing anywhere. Eventually Hudson calmed down again, and all was quiet. I continued to stare out of the window, watching for any signs of the creature's return. For the rest of the night, neither of us slept. We just waited. Every time Hudson got up, my body twitched, waiting for him to start barking again, but he never did. The sun rose and we walked around the cabin but found nothing. We trekked out into the woods but didn't go too far into them. There were no signs that a werewolf monster had been there the night before. I thought to myself maybe Hudson could pick up the trail, And when I said it aloud to my dad, I heard how foolish I sounded. It dawned on me that I didn't actually want to find proof that this thing was out there, and I definitely didn't want to find the thing itself. My dad said we should probably just go back to the cabin and pack up. I didn't have a problem with that. Hi, so I just found this up and figured you guys may be interested in this. I was on an episode of Dogman Encounters Radio about this encounter. So when I was younger, 16 or 17 I think, I had an encounter with something strange in the forests near Danbury, Wisconsin. Background on me is that I am 6'4" and athletic. I'm a hunter, camper, and martial artist. Generally a survivalist. I was naive and didn't give nature the proper level of respect, and basically was a cocky teenager who felt invincible. Our cabin had been on Long Lake in Danbury, Wisconsin. The whole area was forested for the most part. I was there on vacation with my cousin and grandparents. It was a nice and hot summer day, and we had decided to play airsoft. I took airsoft really seriously. I wore a full BDU Woodland with a camouflage mask even. My cousin just wore jeans and a t-shirt. We had a battle which I took into the woods where I felt comfortable. We were about 150 meters into the forest when we stopped. Then I decided to tease my cousin. I shushed him and said, "We were being watched," jokingly. Unfortunately, it turned out to not be much of a joke because I immediately then noticed that the woods were dead quiet, which only happens when a large predator is around. I was on edge, very quickly. Next, the feeling of being watched hit hard, so I started scanning the surrounding area. Then I saw it. The whitish teeth gave it away. What I saw was at the edge of a clearing about 40 meters from us, crouched and holding onto a tree with its left hand. It was panting and watching us with its ears up. It had reddish brown hair and fur, and looked canine. In my head, it clicked as a werewolf. I said to my cousin, "We have to go," and he bolted. I still had my eyes on it when my cousin started sprinting. The creature charged. It ran on two legs for maybe 10 feet and then dropped to all fours. Then I turned and sprinted. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind us when we ran out of the woods. Once back at the cabin, we discussed it. It's still unclear if my cousin saw it. I told him I thought it was a bear to not freak him out, but I know bears. It wasn't a bear. I started doing research on these things after my encounter, which brought me to many dogman related sites. What I saw coincides with other people's sightings. I am now far better about respecting nature, and I'm extremely cautious with the forests. If I go into nature alone, I am always armed, but I prefer to not be alone. Always trust your senses.
My wife and I were traveling to the Smoky Mountains from Ohio on an anniversary getaway. We usually avoid highways in our travels, and instead prefer the scenic and more slower-paced state routes of my childhood. This trip stood out as quite a disaster as we struggled with both the GPS and paper maps while navigating a route I was at least somewhat familiar with. Navigational errors are not our norm, and we quickly found ourselves having an uncharacteristic argument that got fairly heated but was nonsensical. It was like we spoke different languages and were looking at different maps. We eventually found ourselves in increasingly less populated areas and poorer road conditions. For those not familiar with the area, being in central Kentucky, the forest is hilly and expansive, dotted with small towns and the occasional privately owned farm amidst all the federal land. We had eventually quieted down, anxiously following the GPS as it cut in and out. Our anxiety grew until the GPS suddenly chimed in with the "turn left now." I responded by reluctantly starting the turn when my wife suggested it must be a shortcut we were unaware of. Upon completing the turn, I slowed, seeing the road took a sudden drop in quality, potholes large enough to get a tire stuck in, overgrown scrub growth on the edges of ominous gnarled vines hanging down. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as it still does right now as I write it. Bringing the car to a stop, I asked my wife, "Are you sure about this?" As I look towards her, "No, we need to turn around and..." She starts to say, but is cut off, almost frozen, staring at her phone. Not in the way a person freezes when terror sends their muscles trembling, but completely motionless. I instinctively slam into reverse, backing into the position we came out so that I could continue the course we were on. As we reached the end of the reverse turn, I slammed it into drive, but went nowhere as the rear of my early 2000s linked it. I slammed it into drive, but went nowhere as the rear of the early 2000s Lincoln is lifted off the ground. Before I can process what is happening, something charged from the woods to our right. At first, it was a large red blob that moved with a speed and grace that seemed unnatural to its grotesque nature. As I closed the gap, it was clear that it was running on all fours, but only partly so. Its forward movement, agile but uneven as it irregularly used its arms with its oddly bent legs. It's almost like its limbs were growing as it eventually came to a stand on its hind legs and placed its hands on the grass. Up close, I could see what I thought was fur, and it seemed more like strands of rotten flesh that grew as thick and as shaggy as a dog and smelled overwhelmingly of rotten fish and moss. Its hands looked nearly human, where, for the rotten fur and long claws, the face sticks with me as much as the smell. Being somewhat shaped like a human, that has its face twisted and pulled forward in vague canine shape, with large pointed ears toward the top of its head. Inside its snarling mouth were long, narrow teeth that looked almost too large to close. But the eyes, they were the worst part. Bloodshot and yellow. They leered at my wife with hunger, the kind of hunger that promises unspeakable things. When you are in a fight or flight situation, you usually get that distinct moment of clarity when you make your choice, even if it's one you are ashamed of. In that moment, I felt like a small dog, defending my mate from a rabid wolf. I stomped the gas pedal and bellowed hard, "Go now!" and a series of loud noises that sounded more like barks than human noises. It jolted suddenly, and the rear of the car drops, leading to a loud peel-out. It kept pace with us, scratching at the car and banging on it until we broke 45 miles per hour, driving wildly through the winding country until we saw the lights of a town in the distance. We parked in a well-lit parking lot in the center of town, next to a gas station. We busied ourselves as we inspected the car, reluctantly sharing what we thought we saw. She was in tears and sobbing about feeling a pressure in her head and that she was conscious but paralyzed. Looking under the trunk, I spotted a cracked strut and a lump of rotten flesh dangling from a frame member. The smell was still overpowering and sent us into a tear-filled hug as we stared at this piece of filthy creature and realized it was likely at least two of them. The one in the window and the one that lifted the rear axle off the ground. Thoroughly shaken, we sat in the car facing opposite directions and discreetly unpacked our handguns and hid them under our blankets. We waited until 9 or so before setting back off towards our destination via highway. My grandparents own a few acres of land. And on that far right corner of their yard, there's this thick patch of woods and swamp that goes on for a bit before hitting another farm field. I was standing on the back deck, shooting cans with my BB gun. It was a hot and muggy morning in July, and all morning outside I just had a really eerie feeling that I couldn't shake. It was like I was being watched, but every time I look around the yard, I never saw anything. I just kept going back to shooting cans when I felt that feeling again. I started scanning the tree line of the woods. This time, that's when I saw it. It was standing next to a tree, and it was absolutely massive. When I got older, I went back to that tree and tried to get an estimate on the height. I'd say it was 7 to 8 feet tall. The only way I can compare the body is to that of Arnold Schwarzenegger's. It's unreal how big its shoulders, arms, and chest were. It was covered by gray fur that was really shaggy and thick on its shoulders and down part of its body. I know when people describe dogmen, you hear a lot of it looked like a timber wolf standing on 2 legs or had the head of a German shepherd. This is not that at all. The head and face looked like a werewolf. It had pointed ears at the top of its head. Its eyes were yellow and almost seemed to glow even in the daylight. And it was snarling and its lips were open. It almost seemed to be smiling. The look and the smile on this thing's face was pure evil. Sinister is the only way I can describe it. I don't recall if it had a tail or not, and I feel like the legs looked like that of a human's and not bent like a dog's. However, I was mostly looking at the head and body. After what had only been about 10 seconds, but it felt like hours, without warning, it broke eye contact with me and took off sprinting to its right. It went through some really thick brush, emerged further down the tree line, and took off into the woods. The thing is, no person could clear what it cleared in that time that it did. It was seconds that it ran probably a good 50 to 60 yards. And it was all thick brush through there. Being absolutely terrified, I went back in the house and didn't go outside for the rest of the day. Funnily enough, my aunt came up to me later and said, "I heard some strange things outside last night. I've been meaning to tell you, but I didn't want to freak you out." I didn't tell her what I saw, thinking she'd think I was crazy or making it up. But I insisted she tell me. She said she heard a loud growling and snarling walking around the house the previous night, unlike anything she's ever heard before. I still visit my grandparents quite often and haven't seen anything since. I haven't heard of any other reports from the area, but I know there was a Bigfoot road crossing just down the road back in the 60s or 70s. I kinda struggled with this story for years, mostly because I just could not believe what the fuck I saw. I was never too superstitious, but I'd be lying if I said I've never seen any encounters with unexplainable things, and this one hits the top of the list. You don't have to believe me, but good lord, am I being honest. I was camping with my Boy Scout troop in Alpine, New Jersey when I was in early 8th grade, around November of 2010. I stepped out of the cabin in the middle of the night to take a piss and went out and did my business. I stood outside for a second, taking in the campsite. I was standing by a picnic table and glanced around. The moon was so bright that it made the sky look dark blue rather than black, and there was a light fog ominously cascading along the campsite. I heard a rustling in some bushes and didn't think much of it at first, but it continued and got louder. Slowly, I moved my flashlight along until I got the source of the noise, as it got louder and louder. I looked over and saw something that I still don't quite understand, to be honest. This thing was gigantic. It's standing on its hind legs. He was tall and had a muscular body with fur that looked to be black or dark gray. He had the head of a wolf or a dog, only thicker, and the weirdest part, yellow eyes. I stared at him, and he stared at me. And then he just vanished. Ran away faster than I could even blink. I was so bewildered that I blacked out for a minute and had to sit down. But when I went back to the cabin and tried to go back to sleep, I managed to block it out of my mind for a while. Repressed memories is the term, I believe. But it eventually resurfaced when I watched an episode of Monster Quest about werewolves. This doesn't really bother me anymore, truthfully. I actually think it was pretty damn cool. Almost like the setting for a perfect horror movie. The funny thing is, I feel like this thing didn't want to see me any more than I wanted to see him. It's as if we looked at each other and just slightly agreed to say nothing. Leave each other alone and then act like all this shit never happened. I personally don't buy into all that transformation and bark at the moon stuff. I think werewolves are more of an undiscovered species. I stayed with the troop for a while after making Eagle to help mentor some younger scouts, and while I'll always be known as the fun leader, probably due to being closer in age, I still always stress to them that the buddy system is a mandatory at all times, because my night could have been much different if this wolf creature I saw was a little more on the confrontational side.